Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on... No, actually not. Today we're going to talk about Discworld again, because I kind of forgot to do... Not forgot, but distracted. I got distracted a lot, but as you may or may not remember, we're doing a Discworld read-along with a couple of very brave souls out there, and if you want to join us on that, there's still time, right? We're only at book 4, coming up to book 5. Actually, we're going to have a discussion with those who have already read it on Sunday about Sorcery, book 5. So if you haven't, there's still time, the book is short. So maybe go grab a copy. It's fun. It has Bible references in it and other stuff. So go and do that. I'll link it down below. It's a sort of private voice chat discussion that we have about the book, so don't worry, nothing gets recorded. And it's like a very mixed group of people that are reading it for the first time and people that have read it a couple of times. So everyone's welcome. Join us. Let's talk about really dumb jokes and other stuff in Discworld. And now let's talk about the last one, which we had like 2 weeks ago, and I didn't get around to actually recording the video because, life, and then more life and other stuff, and then I tried to record it yesterday and then it didn't work out, and so here we are. Give me another reason to start drinking beer in the afternoon, so that's cool, right? Anyway, let's get started. Well, cheers. Alright, so we're talking about Mort, book 4 in the fourth Discworld novel in publication order, because we're still going through publication order. And this one's probably the first one when we come to publication order that people recommend as a starting point for Discworld if you don't want to go through publication order. There's a bunch of reasons for that I accept. I still maintain that publication order is the best way to read Discworld if, you want to get the full experience, but it is certainly a good entry point if you just want to try out if Discworld is generally something that you might have fun with. I kind of understand that. We're going to talk about why that is the case. So it's obviously not a review, you know that, because I think everyone in the world should read all Discworld novels. There's no exceptions. Except maybe Masquerade and Carpe Jugulum, but that's about it. Anyway, everyone should read all of those, and yeah, I don't need to review that. So what we're going to do is to have a bit of a talk about what is special about this one compared to other, like the previous ones that we had talked about or not talked about, what to look out for, what I personally enjoyed, and where it kind of falls in the whole like Discworld continuity, if you want to call it that, something like that. So that's sort of the plan, what we're going to do here today. So this will obviously be spoilery, because I, on the one hand, don't think that it's possible to spoil Discworld novels that much, although we're coming closer to the point where it is kind of possible because there's more plot and stuff. But still, also it's like over 30-year-old book, so yeah. I guess the main themes are kind of known at this point. So yeah, if you haven't read it, here's the short of it. Go read it, it's brilliant. Read it? Perfect. Now then we can start. So, Mort. There's a couple of reasons why it is so popular. Reason 1, it is about death. And we in the fantasy scene, we like our good death, right? We like violence a lot. We read a lot about violence, war, heroic deaths, and whatnot. But that's not what I mean. This is obviously about death. The death of the Discworld. Capital D, death. And death is one of the most beloved characters in the Discworld series. One of the favorites overall. There's a couple of reasons for that. We'll see some of them in this novel. The idea of making the Grim Reaper your main character and dealing with that is obviously something that we've seen in other books over time that deal with death in a lot of ways. Um, but Pratchett's death has obviously the advantage of being the cliche death that you see from all those Memento Mori images from the Baroque era and all that. The skeleton, the hood, the scythe, it's all there. So that helps when we talk about what he does. Plus, he's also just a very, very humane character, a very human character, and a very humane character, and that also helps. And is certainly one of the reasons why he is one of the favorites, because he lends himself to certain forms of humor, and through those certain forms of mostly absurdist humor, it is possible to make points about the overall human condition, which is sort of what literature always does, and what Terry Pratchett with Discworld does a lot. So that's one of the reasons why I feel Mort is pretty popular and often seen as a book to start Discworld with. The other one is that it is a rather serious book. Now, we've already spoken about it. The first two books, The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic, are both more episodic, like literally short stories or novellas put into like a framing narrative in the first novel, in The Color of Magic, and even the second one, The Light Fantastic, is sort of episodic. You have certain events held together by the travels of Rincewind and Twoflower. So that's not everyone's favorite style of reading a novel, because we are used to having ongoing narratives nowadays in our books a lot. Something that isn't really the case with the kind of fantasy that inspired the first Discworld novels, which is more like your pulp era short story kind of fantasy, your Fafhrd and Grey Mouser and what have you. The second one is so the third one obviously is a bit different. That is Equal Rights has already got an ongoing plot. It still has kind of some episodes in between, because that's something that will be part of Terry Pratchett's style for a long while. That he'll never have like a narrative that is like day by day by day, almost never. But pick out like scenes and then we jump from one event to the next. It's just part of his style. But it has an ongoing plot with a clear goal, a clear the characters have clear goals, that being Karina Smith wants to become a wizard. So we have the first more modern novel, but the humor is still very, very over the top and very absurd in a lot of places. There's a lot of ridiculous stuff going on there, especially near the end with the ant civilization and stuff like that. So it's still a fair bit different from what we might read in modern fantasy. Mort, however, takes this to the next level. Mort is an ongoing story. It has a through line and narrative. It has characters with clear motivations and all of that, but it has a more serious tone. There is a lot of humor in there, a lot of ridiculous humor that I personally really, really appreciate and like. But the overall tone, it's a bit toned down. It is more, while still being absurd in a lot of ways, it is also more like contemporary, like modern day fantasy novels, modern day medieval fantasy. It does go as far overboard with the absurdist humor as the first three novels. So I guess it is for people that are not used to reading absurdist stuff, or are not the greatest fans of your Monty Python or what have you stuff. It may just be an easier or more approachable first contact with Discworld, because it doesn't go that far in that regard. So that I feel is the next bit that makes it a book that people feel is a good entry point to Discworld. It's a comprehensive novel. It has an easy to digest and easy to understand narrative structure. It doesn't go too far into ridiculous, absurdist humor, and it has one of the most likable and most iconic Discworld characters as one of its main characters, that being Death. Now, the next important thing there is, and why I feel what I really appreciate about Mort is, in fact, its serious tone. It's less over-the-top tone. Why is that so? Now, I personally think that Terry Pratchett was one of the most important, influential, and talented writers of the fantastic and generally of the last century. So I'm obviously a fan. But what we learn when we look at Mort is that with Mort, Pratchett adds another facet to his storytelling, to his writing, to his style. With the first two novels being very much absurdist parody of the fantasy genre at the time, mostly. The third book finds Pratchett for the first time openly addressing, obviously stuff like that has been in there before, but clearly addressing real-world political, socio-political questions, in this case gender equality and gender roles in general, in a very humorous way. So that's another facet. It's like we're from just parody, making fun of fantasy, we're at the point where we're also making fun of the real world in a lot of ways when it comes to the ridiculousness of gender roles, which are kind of, don't make a lot of sense in traditional gender roles, I should say here. Now with Mort, we also come to the point where Pratchett shows us that he is capable of writing a more serious novel in a more serious tone. There's still humor in there, but we're certainly at the point where he shows that he's capable of dealing with serious topics, and we're talking about death and grief and stuff like that here, with the necessary, or maybe not necessary, but with a certain gravity that those things maybe warrant. So that's the next facet to making Discworld as a whole series, not like individual novels, but as a whole series, such a versatile thing, because we have all these different aspects of what literature of the fantastic can be. So that's, I guess, one of my personal reasons why I feel Mort is a very good book to read. It's obviously not the darkest Discworld book ever written. It's not the most serious Discworld book ever written. That would probably be Nightwatch, which is also one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Discworld novel ever. But, it's like the first time that Pratchett, further stretching his writer's muscles, if you want to call it that, just goes ahead and proves that he can go in that direction as well. So he's further, establishing Discworld setting as a very, very unique and versatile world in which all these different stories can be told, and something we'll see next week or whenever we talk about sorcery, when we're way more back in the ridiculous, over the top kind of fantasy stuff. So what else is important? Well, further parts of the Discworld setting, Discworld canon, are established in this one. Well, Death gets more of a specific role. I mean, we've seen him in all novels so far. But this time he's like a main character, while we still don't really get an inside perspective on him, which, makes a lot of sense. We certainly see more of him, we go back to the House of Death up there. We meet Isabel again, that we met in the second book, in The Light Fantastic. We see the house with flowers and everything, where Death lives, all of that. We also get the counties of Stohelit and Stolat are shown for the first time as part of the Stowe Plains outside of Ankh-Morpork. So more parts of the actual Discworld geography are kind of described and explained. We even get a short trip to the Agathian Empire, and Nine Turning Mirrors, who was mentioned as Grand Vizier in the first novel, in like literally in the light in the Color of Magic, gets like a small role in this one as well, and the city of Bespelargic, where everyone's favorite tourist Two Flower came from. So these are just like, further parts where the rather chaotic Discworld geography and world building of the first novels is further, formalized is probably the right word here, and put into like, some sort of order. We get a little bit more about the Unseen University, but not that much. About like the rules of magic. One of them's obviously the one that they're not allowed to have kids, which kind of makes sense. Well, it doesn't make sense, but it kind of builds into the whole idea of like how wizardry works in Discworld. What else is like general, like setting wise, important? The Shades are probably mentioned for the first time as the darkest quarter of Ankh-Morpork, or like the most brutal quarter of Ankh-Morpork. So there's a lot of stuff that gets further added or built up made just like bit by bit made more real or more firm in like the Discworld canon, which it's cool. And now let's look at a few interesting themes and facets here. Now, obviously, the plot line of Death getting an apprentice in the hopes of leaving his job to the apprentice and getting out of being Death is a really interesting one, because it raises the question, like, why is Death tired of his job? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Another one is obviously something that we see here play out again, is the idea of playing with certain expectations of narratives. One of them here is obviously the romance story, and how Terry Pratchett goes and kind of subverts that one in a very, very deliberate way, which I personally really appreciate. Another one is once again the question of reality and what makes reality, which is one of the like major concerns of Discworld, right? There's a bunch of them. One of them is obviously the power of imagination as something that sets humans apart from other creatures or other beings. Another one is the question what makes up reality, that being a consensus reality of what we all think we see or think we know about the world, which is something that we see a lot of in Discworld. These are themes or topics that crop up in Terry Pratchett's writing all over the text, which, there's a book called Terry Pratchett, The Philosophy of Discworld, which deals with some of these topics in a more academic way, and we might talk about that at some point as well. But these are parts of like that make up the Discworld worldview, or possibly also Terry Pratchett's worldview. So these are obviously present again. But now let's talk about the death thing. Now, obviously, something that I've said before is that there are parallels between Discworld death and everyone's favorite undead Jaghut, that being Hood, the god of death in the Malazan world. And they face a similar, problem, difficulty, or whatever you want to call it. And so I might go and actually do like a full-on comparison between the two characters at a later stage, we'll see. But today we're going to talk just about Discworld and just about death. Now, the main issue here is the question of justice, of death. Now, the question is pretty obvious. It's like you look at the world, you see people, you see the deaths of people or animals, what have you, And you realize those are not just. If you have an idea of what just is, everyone gets what they deserve, and so forth, things that make sense, make for good stories, because let's face it, making a good story is something that we kind of expect from the world, even though it almost never happens. When we look at the universe, we realize relatively soon that this is not how it works. The world, people die that deserve to live, people live that is, well, difficult to say. If you want, you don't want to go into like they deserve to die. At least I hope so. Which, goes back to the whole like Gandalf to Frodo debate about judgment, which we're going to come back to in a second. So the point is, we look at the world and we find it's not just. People, death is never just, or not, almost never just. And there's two things that come from that. One of them is like who decides who has to die and who can live. And the other one is like, if that creature is not the person, is not death, but some overarching, what you might call fate or gods or the universe, which would be random. What about that person, or what about that person that is in charge or connected, deeply connected, or the personification, which we're going to talk about in a second, of the process of dying, the random act of dying, which would be, the ending of the physical body and whatever happens with the soul afterwards. Now, obviously, that only works if you believe in souls, but for our argument here, that is just how it works. There's souls in Discworld. There's also souls in Malazan, obviously. So yeah, what we have here is what about that person whose only job is to make sure that souls leave bodies at the appointed time. If that person, or if that being is sentient and has a sense of morality, of morals, how can that being live with the fact that there is fundamental injustice in in the thing that it attends, in the act that it attends as its function, right? Death knows that death is never just. And when he always says that in this world, there's no justice, there's just us, or there's just like me. Well, obviously me, or you know what I mean. And what we learn over time is that it takes a toll of that being. So with Malazan, we see Hood being really pissed off at the gods and other things at some point because of justice and so forth. And with Death, we see him taking a different out. That is, the more human he becomes, the more he struggles with the fact that these things are unjust. He tries to, forget, or tries to leave the job, to give it to someone else so he doesn't have to bear that burden anymore, because it becomes clear that that is a burden, that injustice, and not being able to do anything about it is a burden. So that's like the main conflict of Death, which is a rather tragic one. So let's keep that in mind when we talk about all the absurdist humor that we get with Death later on. The main conflict, or the main issue for Death, his main character thing, is a very tragic one. He's in charge of something that he has no power over. He just has to see to the fact that these things work. And his personal feelings on the matter, or like views on the matter, are out of the question. So he's powerless to do anything about it, but he's also powerless to prevent himself being there. He can't just like leave the job either. So what we learn here is him trying to get rid of it by finding someone else to take over the job, which doesn't work that well, but that's the other side of that. That being that humans would be extremely bad at taking over that job, because it is fundamental for human nature to strive for justice, at least in a way. and to do something that is also fundamental for human nature. In later books, we might come to a point where death is taking on more of that human nature, and that being to rebel against such unfairness, or we perceive unfairness. It's human nature to do something about it, or to get angry. And we see that in the novel as well, which, once again, is really good. Now let's come and talk about the human condition and how to, illuminate it through absurdist humor. And we do that with death once again. We have death, right? And he is not human. It's clear that he is not human, but he tries to be human. He tries to emulate human behavior, to imitate human behavior. Whether it is like him adopting a daughter, having a manservant. I mean, he doesn't actually have to eat. He just loves to eat, which is, he goes and eats curry in the curry gardens, for example. He gets drunk later on. He gambles. He does all these things that are typically seen as like specific human activities. When he tries to figure out what fun is, he goes fishing, which is ridiculous. Anyway, through the act of depicting a clearly non-human person, an outsider, trying to take part in these very, very human activities that I guess most of us, at least some of them, we have participated in. I don't know how many of you have gambled. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to get really, really drunk. Many of you have tried to, go to a party, which is very different from getting drunk. Just saying. Or have gone fishing, or any other of these things, but stuff like having fun, wasting time doing things that are not strictly necessary for sheer survival are part of what makes humans human. That the fact that we do that, playing obviously is one of them, which are necessary for the human condition, but not necessary from a purely biological point of view. At least, unless you go into like really ridiculous and not well-researched parts of neuroscience, which we don't do here. So through the vehicle of death, the clearly non-human, we come to the point where we can see the absurdity of that, because the absurdity in that humor that we have here is that we as a reader can sit back and say, wow, holy shit, is getting drunk a stupid thing, or gambling, or whatever. And once we realize how ridiculous our behavior is, we can ideally appreciate and enjoy it way more than we could before. So, I mean, that's the goal of it, is to make fun of it, but in a human way. And I've said that before. I'll stand by this. Like, you can only make fun of something that you actually like, because making fun of something or humor about something that you personally don't understand or don't like will always be mean-spirited, mean, and thus not funny. So reading the parts where death tries to be more human, or figure out what it actually is that makes humans human, is indeed finding that funny, is about accepting the absurdity of human existence, which I could call existentialist in a way. I mean, go read, I don't know, Camus. Read Camus. It's way better than reading Sartre, but that's just me. Anyway, so that's a huge part of this book as well, is like to understand human nature and the absurdity of human life in a way. Now let's look at the other things quickly. One of them is obviously the idea of how reality is what we believe and think. A consensus reality which is played with in a great way when like history has kind of censored Princess Kaylee out, and the Royal Rememberer remembrance job is to make sure that everyone still remembers that she exists, because if no one knows she exists, she's suddenly gone. This obviously also plays into the whole idea and the whole role of like the subaltern, that parts of society have no voice, not thus not recognized in official historiography or anything like that, which you see a lot of in like post-colonial studies and things like that. When you say The Subaltern Speaks is one of those books about exactly that kind of topic. And we see that really clearly in the scenes when Kaylee goes down into into the castle, and meets people that she has never seen before. An even clearer version of that we'll see early on when Mort and Death come to the assassination of Kaylee's father, the old Duke or King of Stolat. And it's like Mort would never be seen by those people, not because he's invisible, because he's the servant of death, but because those people are aristocrats. And aristocrats are really good at not seeing people they don't think are important. So we have that bit in there on the one hand, and showing that it is something that happens to a lot of people on a daily basis, but then with her being Kaylee being X'd out by history, it suddenly happens to someone in in a highly privileged position, which makes the whole issue, the whole problem, clearer for us to understand, or at least I feel that's kind of what it does there. So once again, that's a really interesting theme and topic that Pratchett deals with in this book, but also in other books later on. We have that come up a couple of times. So another one of those recurring themes in Discworld novels. Now, the thing that I wanted to point to is obviously we still have his very typical Pratchett prose and style, in that he oftentimes breaks what you might call immersion. There's no such thing as immersion in a Discworld novel. It's just not what this is about. But one thing that I found really clever is when he switches scenes with a dialogue, and then breaks the fourth wall by explaining what he just did there. What he did there, and with visual cinematic terms, by explaining that this would look really well in a movie when you have two people say the same line and you just switch scene between those two, and so forth, which is really cool to use visual techniques, and by explaining them as a visual technique to us and still use them in a novel, and to make kind of fun of. Another option, scene of that, is when Mort is attacked by these muggers, and it's there are those kind of people that at this point in a narrative have to attack the the protagonist, but not there should be a challenge, but not too much of a challenge, because he has to survive to actually come to further and so forth. And that's exactly what will happen in the next scene. And by explaining what he does, he makes these techniques, these tropes, very, very explicit, and then just actually does them, and he subverts them in a way by not subverting them within the story, but by just making very clear what kind of technique he's using at that scene, which I found really cool. And then obviously we have once more things like scenes where he uses metaphors or allegories or examples from our world, and use them to explain something within the fantasy world, which ones works. What else was interesting or funny? Because this is the thing that he does. He explains that whole movie style of visual style of storytelling with that scene when he cuts basically from one scene to the other over a dialogue line. And then we have that scene later on when Mort and Isabel are reading the book, reading Albert's life story, and reading basically how he arrives to their ladder and everything. It's clear pages before how this will turn out, and it's a typical scene that you might find in something like a horror story, or a horror movie, even more I guess. But it's used in a more explanatory way to just like show how these techniques, or like make very clear how these techniques are used in other kinds of media, which, you know, it's really cool. And yes, the romance, we need to talk about it quickly before we talk about, well, I guess that's kind of what we, sort of the end of it. Like, the romance, it's very clear from the beginning how this works, because you have the typical romance, Mort's, I mean, you have two of them. You have Mort saving the princess, which is your fairy tale version, which obviously doesn't end that way because he doesn't marry the princess. And we have the, it's not exactly an enemies to lovers trope, because right from the beginning, once again, it's very clear where this will end from the very first scene when they are mad at each other. Or just like petty, because that's just how 15 or 16-year-old kids oftentimes are. So it's just like very interesting, because it kind of ends up exactly the way that Death seems to plan from the beginning, but not because of Death's very inept matchmaking, but basically because that's sort of how like narratives work in the end, which is something that we come to in later Terry Pratchett novels when we're talking about narrative causality. But it kind of is shown here to, like, in like a first version of how that kind of works or doesn't work. So yeah. Oh, right. I need to talk about one really terrible joke, which I really loved. It's like when they're looking at Death's book, and Albert uses, like, Latin, and just, like, says, sodomy non sapiens, and Mort is asking, what do you mean? He's like, buggered if I know, which is probably the best use of Latin, unauthorized use of Latin I've seen in a long time, and it's just, like, ridiculously good. But it's, you know, there's a bunch of, like, really cool jokes in there once again. The speaking door knocker, and, you know, the humor is still there. It's just it's taking a backseat sometimes in favor of the more serious themes, which you might call Mort a more mature Discworld novel compared to the first three. But as we'll see in the next one, Sorcery, that is kind of temporary, because we'll go back to the more absurdist, over-the-top side of Discworld really soon. So, to wrap up the whole thing, Mort is the first really serious Discworld novel in themes. It's also a more well-rounded, well-executed novel when it comes to the overall, like, plot and narrative in this one, compared to the one before, to Equal Rights. It features the most popular, or one of the most popular Discworld characters, one of the most iconic Discworld characters, with Death. And it talks about the really, really important aspects of human existence, the human condition, what makes us human, how do we deal with the injustice of the universe, and all these big themes. And thus, it is absolutely a really good entry point into the Discworld series, and yeah, certainly one of the early highlights in the series. Yeah. That being said, I obviously love it, and I'll be interested to read your thoughts on it in the comments. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share, join the discussion for Sorcery, and I promise I'll be quicker with the next video, so people will have more time to actually go and read the sixth novel if they just find the book right now, the video when it comes out. Anyway, thanks again, and have a great day. Cheers.